Good morning. Nice to see all of you here again. I think we talked a little bit 5-6 weeks ago, at least some of you. How many of you were in that session, cheerleading session before Making and Meaning started? Just nobody? Yeah? You can acknowledge it. There's no punitive consequences. I think in that, this is not a rerun of that discussion, but there was a point that I made, and I want to make it again, about building and the meaning of building. I think in a certain fundamental way that over a period of 5 years or 3.5 years, or 2.5 years, and I think there are a few people that'll be here for 1 year, but whatever the term of your term at SCI-Arc, that one of the essentials, one of the critical points is that the materialization of these ideas in the world, you gotta build it. You gotta build it or it doesn't count. So this is a little bit hyperbole, it's a little bit exaggeration. We know, and you'll see with Lebbeus Wood's show and the installation we did, that there are any number of architects who have contributed in terms of content, discourse, ideas, imagination, who haven't built buildings. But I think from the point of view of this school, however it's evolved, however it's changed, and you'll be part of that evolution and part of that change over the years, it's essential that we understand that the uncompromised result of this discussion is build it, can you build it, implement it, how do you implement it? I think that really moves the discussion of architecture from building to building over the course of time. So I said that before to the Making and Meaning students. I wanted to make that point again to you guys. You're welcome. We're happy to have you. There are a lot of ways to look at the SCI-Arc experience. I could give you one rendition. I was sitting in my office this morning just picking out a few images. I could have picked any number of images on any number of topics. If there are 200 people in this room, there may be 201 renditions of what it means to be a student at SCI-Arc 5 years from now, or 3.5 years from now, or 2.5 years from now. Because I think one of the essential operational principles here is that after all of this discussion, life is personal and architecture is personal. And although the discussions are in groups and collectives and juries and studios and seminars, I would like to think that there's at least some aspect of this that differentiates you from you from you, and that if we do our job and if you do your job, we'll arrive at a way, we'll figure out how to pull out of you what is uniquely in you. And that allows you uniquely to contribute to the discussion of architecture, which is constantly in motion. I think one of the essential qualities of the experience here is a level of respect, but not much reverence. I think our expectations of you and your group is really simply this, that you'll look at what I do and you'll listen to what I say. And you'll look at what other architects do in lectures, on juries, in exhibits, all of the ways we have to share with you what the content of international architecture is in the world, as it was, as it is, and what it might be as a speculation. So you'll look at all of that, you'll listen to all of that, you'll evaluate all of that, But what you won't do is acquiesce in the face of all of that. That means we're not trying to teach you that if you want to be a radical architect, we're going to talk about what radical means in 2 seconds. If you want to be a radical architect, here's what you do. Here's what you listen to. Here's who you copy. Here's how you draw it. Here's how you model it. Here's how you argue it. That's really not the point. The point is to familiarize yourselves with those perspective, points of view, strategies, ways of thinking, ways of working, ways of seeing, ways of imagining. Will help you to do that. And then what you're going to do, and you'll see it when the school opens up in a week, you'll see it in the thesis, then you're going to give your view of that back to us. That's really what the thesis is. The undergraduate program thesis is a little bit different than a graduate program thesis. But the point of that is to say, we've offered, now you respond. So what I would say is that the approach in studios, in seminars, in drawing classes, in modeling classes, and discussions of all kinds, is that what we encourage you to do is to find a way to be you in the context of the discourse on architecture. That's not always easy. It's not always obvious. Your point of view might change, should change, will change, but it's important that you understand that we think you have a role as individuals in a school like this, where the discussion is always moving, and in a profession like this, where in a certain sense the profession you'll find has a certain intransigence. So you know what that means? What it means is whatever is there or whatever is established, there always is a certain amount of resistance to somebody, maybe somebody here, maybe a few people here, who comes to kick it in and say, the world should be different. It should be other than what it is. And people who are in positions of authority, advocates, power, architects, directors of schools, almost inevitably tell you this is the way it should be. So what I'm asking you to do is listen to that. You can listen with some deference and some respect, depending on how you evaluate the people who are speaking. But keep in mind that if the school goes the way the school should go, in the end, you'll offer something as an alternative. You'll offer something. We're asking that of you. Again, I understand it won't come out of everyone. It won't come out of everyone simultaneously. It won't come out of everyone while you're in school. It may come out 5, 10, 15 years. But you might recall this in a different context, in a different frame of reference. So I think that point of view, the point of view of evaluating but relying in the end on the critical intellectual capacity and the imaginative capacity that you bring to the discussion. So we're interested in that. We're interested in bringing it out, ferreting it out, and so on and so on. I think this is the primary objective, the primary lesson, and that's how SCI-Arc keeps moving. That's why in a conventional sense, in a discussion sense, when somebody says, where's SCI-Arc going? The answer, again, this is a bit hyperbole, but also to some extent, I think, true, and we feel it to be true. The direction of SCI-Arc, the pedagogy of SCI-Arc, is not an established way of thinking and learning. The future is always ahead of us, and the future remains to be invented. So if that sounds a little bit like cheerleading, it's cheerleading for you. It is cheerleading. That doesn't mean it isn't so. That doesn't mean it isn't possible. It happens, and it continues to happen. That's how ideas in the course of the discourse of architecture move and change and evolve. So we're expecting to give you some illustrations, manifestations, examples of that, and we're expecting that you'll give something of that kind back to us. So that's the SCI-Arc pro forma. I picked, as I said, a couple of images. I could have picked almost any. None of them you will notice. None of them you will notice have anything to do literally with building. There are no building images. I think one of the things that's worth understanding is that when you talk about people as individuals, and we say architecture and the study of architecture, one architect at a time, there are things in you, there are things you know, there are things you've done, there are places you've gone, there are things you've read, there are things you haven't read, there are places you haven't gone, there are things you haven't done. And uniquely, if you went around the room, you would see some similarities, you would see some significant differences. Again, we're looking for what is unique in you and trying to find a way to pull that out in the course of this discussion. For instance, and this is the kind of lexicon when you hear discussions of architecture, and somebody says digital, and somebody says clean, and somebody says context, and somebody says layering, all of that. So what you have to be careful of, it's not plug your ears, but what you have to be careful of is that you don't learn to repeat a format that already exists with a vocabulary that I think pretends to define what architecture is. You have to figure out in your own way, with your own tools, your own trips, readings, adventures, and so on, how to describe what you're doing. I think one of the difficult issues in the discussion of architecture so often is how little room there is to discuss, because the vocabulary of the discussion precedes you. It precedes you, and what you figure out is you walk into the review, you walk into the jury, you walk into the discussion, the instructor says something, and then you repeat the words, and that's okay. Everybody repeats the words. Everyone has a certain basis for understanding. I think you have to be careful of that. The originators of those words, the people who raised those discussions initially, had something different to offer. Those are really the people who are the interesting characters. But very quickly, and architecture has a habit of this, of absorbing strategies, organizational tactics, vocabularies, and so on, that come to be shared very quickly. And the originality of the invention then starts to dissipate, and it starts to be not something that a group or a person or a few architects are working on, but something that becomes a general property that everyone uses. So the advice from this end is be careful of the jargon. Be careful of the jargon. It's all around you, and the best way to avoid that is to try to find your own means, even if it's sloppy, even if it's crude, even if it's awkward, even if it's clumsy, but it belongs to you. And as you start to discover and find ways of articulating what you discover, this is a very critical faculty in the development of a kind of intelligence in the expression of what we expect from you here, and I think ultimately what architecture expects. I mentioned, so this is a Manet painting. Maybe some of you know it, I think, from the middle of the 19th century. I think it's called Luncheon on the Grass. And it raises an interesting question of what's the norm and what's the exception. And what I always appreciated about the painting, it's not a standard scene in a standard park with a standard lunch with a couple of guys and a couple of girls, whatever it is. So, but it's presented that way. I think this is what interests me So there's a couple of characters sitting around having a conventional discussion, except at least a few of the parties are undressed. And I think the idea, and this was considered, if not offensive, certainly a radical, unusual, not to say scandalous presentation in terms of a way of looking at contemporary art at that point in time. And yet it's presented as if it were completely the norm. And one of the interesting strategic opportunities facing us is not only what you do, but how you describe what you're doing. And if the description is you speak to a contractor, it's twisted, it's bent, it's difficult to construct, so on and so on, then the perception is that making that effort would be extraordinary and extraordinarily difficult. If you present it as something which is normative, doable, intelligible, comprehensible, so this is just another day in the park, or is it? And I think the juxtaposition of what's unusual in how you present it versus what's normative in how you present it. And maybe the trick is you can get away with a hell of a lot of stuff by acting like you're not getting away with much of anything. So this is just another day in the park and just another painting. Or maybe not. I don't know if you know this story. Do you know the story of Narcissus? It's a Greek story of an attractive guy who was enthralled with his attractiveness, found his image in a pool, stared at the image, pursued the image, fell into the water, and drowned. So this is the Greek story of Narcissus. This isn't quite Narcissus. Is a cartoon character some of you may know. But the line, we've found the enemy, and the enemy is us, is another way of me saying that the responsibility for your pursuit of the discourse of architecture here at SCI-Arc belongs to you. I think to take that responsibility. The enemy isn't the contractor or the banker or the client or, for that matter, the faculty member, that the onus of this or the responsibility for this in the end belongs to you. So if we say architecture one architect at a time or one student architect at a time, that puts a substantial responsibility on you. What's interesting about this image, and I was just looking at it this morning, he's surprised at what he sees. So this may suggest something slightly different than Narcissus, who was enthralled by what he saw. This is another version. This is a Salvador Dali version. And I'm not quite sure, I like the image, I'm not quite sure how it fits in the discussion, but it is the reflected image. But as the image reflects, and this may have to do with how things evolve, that what it reflects is different than what is being reflected. So when you look in the mirror, what you want to see in a certain sense is something coming out of the mirror which is different than what you gave the mirror. Meaning the discussion, I don't know any mirrors that do that, but maybe you have one. Salvador Dali had one. But it's an interesting conception of looking at yourself and evaluating yourself, and instead of yourself coming back to yourself, something starts to change. So whatever you offered the mirror offers something else back. And this is really a metaphorical way of looking at an evolution of personality rather than a restatement of that personality. I had a student at Yale years ago who collected a series of music scores by the composer John Cage. You know Cage? You know the name? See, so maybe it's it's a name that you could dig into. One of the reasons I said there were no images here of buildings, and there are no images of buildings, because part of the repertoire of architecture, and I think the larger your intellectual repertoire, the broader your experiences, the greater the range of discussion, the more you can bring to architecture from outside architecture, which might make architecture very different than what it is now. Therefore, drawing is of some interest. Music scores are of some interest. Music has a relationship, much discussed, not to discuss it here, but a conceptual relationship, imagination of music, imagination of architecture, and so on and so on. Cage drew music scores, which were unlike the conventional music score pro forma that you know conventionally. They're visual, they're art pieces, and that what he did was make music not so much in an auditory way meaning what do you hear, but he made music in terms of what you might see. So if you look at the scores, so to some extent the music or the auditory side took the consequence of the visual side. So why is this interesting? It really has to do with juxtaposing a conventional idea about music and listening to music and scoring music and reversing the priorities and developing music scores for visual reasons rather than simply auditory reasons. Just a way of thinking, and thinking in a novel way. So that whatever the subject matter is, we needn't necessarily regurgitate the standard pro forma for looking at music or writing music or scoring music, but there might be a different way to see it. I think those differences are there to be discovered. Nobody should make the mistake of thinking that they've all been discovered. This is a Russian artist from the 1930s, and the drawing called Malevich. You know Malevich? Constructivist artist. And the drawing, and there were many of these drawings in the era where there was a lot of enthusiasm for communism and socialism and a new world. And this is a new world. And the name of this drawing is The New Man. The New Man. So this is now an antiquated idea. The new man turned out to be the old man. The new man was Fidel Castro. The old man is Fidel Castro, and so on and so on. But what I wanted to say, and I think it's worth thinking about, is there may always be, and we should keep this in mind, there's always another new man, woman, that the idea, the image may be antiquated. The ideology that was wrapped up in making this drawing may be passé, old news now. But the aspiration or the ambition to say we can turn it over, we can reinvent it, we can make it new. So there's someone new, and in this case, with a different worldview, with a different sociology, with a different economic point of view, all of that. These characters thought the world is changing. The world is changing. History is moving based on various ideological suppositions. Turned out didn't quite work that way. Maybe in some cases it turns out like that, maybe not. But the optimism, I think this is really a critical point, that the optimism for somebody to say, look, there have been X amount of millennia of history. The world stays as it is. No, there have been X amount of millennia of history. We still want to retain the prospect that it could be other than it is, even if the particular image is dated. This one always interested me. This is, anybody know who this is? So this is Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai in 19 72, 73, when the Nixon administration went to China and opened up, strangely enough, and opened up a very different chapter in terms of the American relationship to China. And Kissinger this really has to do with, again, time, like the Malevich drawing. So Kissinger is supposed to have said to Zhou Enlai, so they're both intellectual characters interested in history. Kissinger was teaching at Harvard before he came to work in the Nixon administration. And Kissinger is supposed to have said to Zhou Enlai, what do you think about the French Revolution? What do you think about the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai is supposed to have said, I don't know. Not enough time has passed. I don't know, not enough time has passed. And the way the conversation is talked about, it is often characterized as representing the American point of view, which is you got to have an answer in 30 seconds or less, and the East Asian point of view, which is only over long periods of time are topics understood. And I think this is just interesting in terms of a human perspective. What you're looking at, what you're watching, whether you're watching the news or architecture news and so on, and how you evaluate it. In other words, is it an evaluation that everybody shares? Is it an evaluation that you might have reason to change at a different point? In other words, is the person that you're being told unimportant, and the person who you think might be important, although you might be told is less important, that might change, that might move. So keep in mind, for some strange reason, history keeps being rewritten and redone, including contemporary history. So nobody says that the point of view that you're given about a subject is the enduring point of view. Some of that belongs to you and your responsibility, and whether you take that responsibility on or not, the issue of the movement of ideas and your ability to evaluate those and to see the world in a different way, I think, is very critical to the mindset in architecture. And this is the other point of view, which you people, and I guess everybody else, bumps into with regularity, meaning that's so 1989, or that's so 2008, or that's so 15 minutes ago. And I think the point probably is that you'll be told, and it will be often repeated, that everything's moving, everything's changing, everything's different, faster and faster and faster. You better keep up or you're lost. And whatever exactly the truth of what's changing or not changing is, it's probably fair to say that some aspects of human existence, some aspects of design and architecture are durable or more durable, others more ephemeral. So the issue of change, like the issue of time, is a topic to consider, but I wouldn't salute every time somebody tells you it's out of date, that's so 20 minutes ago. It's not true. This goes back to a little bit back to Kissinger and Zhou Enlai. I think I picked this up in a magazine recently, and it struck me because in terms of the East Asia discussion, the China discussion, and the assumption that manufacturing belongs now to East Asia, doesn't belong to America anymore, cheap labor in East Asia, Vietnam, Taiwan, China, Singapore, and so on and so on. And that's the way the world is going, get it? And America and Europe don't do that anymore and shouldn't anticipate that they will. Wait a minute. And now comes, so that's said and known and understood and repeated, and that's the way it is. And then all of a sudden now comes something quite different, that manufacturing of various kinds is coming back to Europe, coming back to Western Europe anyway, coming back to the United States in the form of tools like you find in the robot house. So sophisticated technical pieces of equipment, like the space stuff that is crawling around on Mars and so on, and requires a sophisticated labor force, workforce, is now in the ascendancy. So the manufacturing that was not here and never coming back is now here and coming back. So that's not to say that the bromide, that all manufacturing belongs to East Asia, is entirely false. It means that as soon as everyone started to say that's the way it is, now comes something quite different. So this is also something to keep your eye on and to watch, that the rules and the theories and the conventions, it's not even an argument, everybody accepted that. Manufacturing dead in Europe, dead in America. Not true, changing. This is a little bit melodramatic. I don't mean it to be. I actually like the image and I like the story. This is a Greek character, well, two versions. One is a contemporary, relatively contemporary version in a book called The Myth of Sisyphus, which is written by an author called Albert Camus. Maybe you know Camus, writing in the middle of the last century. And he used the story of Sisyphus, the guy who pushes the rock. You know the story or no? Yeah, the guy who pushes the rock, and he pushes the rock up to the top of the hill, and just when he gets to the top of the hill, guess what? So it rolls down the other side, and guess what? Then he goes down, and he gets it, and he pushes it, and so on, and so on, and so on. That's it. Forever. And what that has to do with the education process in architecture is a little bit complicated. I think in the first place, the punishment, the reason in the story, in the myth, the reason Sisyphus was assigned this is, I guess, he and Zeus was the head guy, and it didn't agree on a few things. And Sisyphus thought he was extremely intellectually clever and sophisticated and tried to demonstrate that in various ways. So Zeus, to reciprocate, Zeus, the chief god, to reciprocate, showed Sisyphus how clever Zeus was by inventing this kind of eternal punishment or image. So beat that. You know, Sisyphus wasn't in a position to argue, so this was his punishment. The contemporary version with Camus looked at this as a metaphor for life in a strange way and in a difficult way, that the issue is always to push it, not to concede to it, not to give up. And if it slips, you go and get it and do it. And his conclusion, which is interesting, his conclusion, maybe this should be our conclusion. His conclusion is that Sisyphus was extremely happy doing this. Now, what precisely is the analogy to the process of architecture, I think, belongs to each one of the 200 people in the room. It is sometimes a push. It is sometimes a chase. It is sometimes a fight. Sometimes you gain it. Sometimes you lose it. But I can tell you there's a fundamental wonder and happiness in that. And my guess is that when you get to the end of the 5 or the 3.5 or the 2.5, you'll come back and tell me wonder and happiness was the product of the SCI-Arc adventure. So I look forward to that conversation. Thank you very much.